All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to make a start. First of all, thank you all for joining us. I want to give a 2-minute introduction and thanks before I hand over to our star guests, who we're very privileged to have. But first of all, before I do that, I just want to thank those shuls that have partnered and worked together. We did this so much when we were in lockdown and during the pandemic. Over the last few months, as we've returned more and more to face-to-face events, we've lost out on that. So to be able to join together again for such important, an important topic and such privilege, we're privileged to have the speakers that we have tonight is a real pleasure. So first of all, of course, to Dinella Shul in Perth, where I grew up, to Mizrahi that I'm representing, to Or Hadash, Cremord Synagogue, the great synagogue in Kadima. Over these 3 weeks, I think different rabbis from each organization will either introduce or conclude the evening, but a real pleasure as we begin this 3-week series. And I just wanted to point that out and thank everybody who was part of that and promoting it and part of this series as well. Tonight begins, first of all, tonight is Lag BaOmer. I know, Professor Saiman, for you, it's the morning still. But Lag BaOmer in part celebrates the transmission of the oral Torah, which is so much part of what Jewish law is today, and what I think in the nature of Jewish law, our two guests will be speaking about tonight. So although most people often associate Lag BaOmer with bonfires and celebrations and parties, this is also, I think, an appropriate way to be celebrating it as well. Now, I do want to briefly also introduce our two guests. First of all, I think people are more familiar with my father, Rabbi Justice Solomon, who is a Justice of the Supreme Court of Western Australia, and the Rabbi of Beit Midrash of WA, Dinella Shul Mizrahi in Perth, Professor Chaim Saiman. And I know one of you is waking up and one of you is finishing a work day. Professor Saiman, we so much appreciate you joining us, especially because you've, I assume, had to wake up quite early for this. A scholar of Jewish law, private law, and published Halakha, the rabbinic idea of law, with Princeton University Press, a Dayan of the Beit Din of America, and has lectured and been a guest professor in many prestigious universities across the United States of America. We're really privileged to have you with us. I assume this is your first introduction to Australians over Zoom, but thank you so much. No, it's not. Okay. But thank you.
I've been to Australia twice.
Oh, wow.
Once to Sydney and once to Melbourne. So you're right. This is my first introduction over Zoom, but I've done better. So I spent a week or so in Sydney about 15 years ago, and a week or so in Melbourne, probably about 4 years ago.
Right, so you know what we're like, and we're privileged to have you with us, not just tonight, but over this 3-week series. I'm going to hand over now to my father, but I do also just want to point out for those, because I had a couple of questions about this. If you've signed up, and booked, which is, I assume, everybody on this Zoom, and that's for all 3 weeks, not just for tonight. So you don't need to sort of think about booking again. You've signed up for all 3 weeks. And for those that can't actually make it tonight or can't make it to hear this live in upcoming weeks, there will always be a recording provided as well following the talk for those who missed it. I'm now going to hand over to my father and Professor Saiman. Thank them both very much for joining us and being part of this amazing series. And I'll leave the rest to you guys. Sorry, before I do that, one last thing, and that is that after that, Rabbi Alon will facilitate questions with our two guests and then conclude the evening. Now, finally, over to you guys.
Thanks, Shua, and thank you to everyone involved in setting this up, Rabbi Alon and the various shuls, and of course to Shua. Perhaps I should, before I get into the guts of things, also thank Professor Saiman for getting up at a very early hour. I think it's 6 a.m. for him. It's the end of a court day for me, and I'm impressed that Professor Saiman's at least managed to get dressed at all, let alone look very respectable. So well done. I should tell people that Professor Saiman and I are not strangers. As it happened, I'm in debt to a debt of gratitude to Rav Alon, because I actually happened to read Professor Saiman's wonderful book on halakha, the rabbinic idea of law. And by coincidence, Rav Alon said to me that he was trying to organize a series of a conversation between myself and Professor Saiman. As it then happened, I was due to go to the United States for a few days, and I was going to be there for Shabbos, and I hadn't yet made Shabbos arrangements. And so one thing led to another, and I spent Shabbos with Professor Saiman in Philadelphia, which was a wonderful Shabbos, a really wonderful Shabbos in which we got to know each other and discuss some of these things that hopefully will unfold in our discussion this evening and in subsequent discussions. So that's by way of introduction. So what took me to Professor Saiman, Professor Rabbi Saiman, was his book, published by Princeton University Press, called Halakha, the Rabbinic Idea of Law. And I want to start with that. Yes.
Product placement.
So I want to start with that because there are two things that struck me immediately about that book. The first one was the best dedication I've ever read in a book. And if you read the book, you'll understand the depth and profundity of this dedication. The dedication is to Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, but the dedication reads like this: to my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who would never have written this book, but without whom this book would never have been written. And I hope that after the series that we intend to have, B'ezrat Hashem, you'll understand the profundity in that comment. But the other thing that struck me immediately about the book is that it begins in chapter 1 with a quote from the New Testament. It's not often you read a book from a Talmudic scholar and a rabbi that begins with the New Testament. And it's a quote from Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, which begins as follows: "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." And that, I think, reflects a common critique and possibly a misconception of what Jewish law is, what its function and role is, as well as its content. And that, I think, is the introduction to what I first want to discuss. And the idea is that this will evolve and unfold as a discussion between myself and Rabbi Saiman from our various perspectives. So I want to kick off that discussion by asking Professor Saiman, in the context of that introduction, so what is law in Judaism and what is halakha? Are they the same? What are they? Professor Saiman.
Great, thank you. First of all, I just want to return the honors. As I said, I've actually got to know Rabbi Meltzer in a slightly different context, and then Justice and I were talking, and then he told me he's coming to Philadelphia. I live in a town called Ballykinwood, which, though it sounds like it's in Wales, is just outside Philadelphia, and we had a wonderful Shabbos together. And a friend of mine asked, seeing us kind of schmoozing, he said, "How long have you known, the justice?" And I said, "We met about 40 minutes ago." And he said, "You guys look like you've known each other forever." So it was one of those moments, and it's great to be with you. And I do hope to be back in Australia. The 2 times I was there was for law-related conferences, and I did not really get much out of the cities. So
you need to see the real part of Australia, Professor.
Right, that's what everybody tells me. So I need to come with that purpose, or at least with more of that in mind. So I do hope to be back. And thank you for those warm words. As I said, I apologize for my relative lack of formality, but getting up early, I couldn't manage to put on a tie and jacket. But my recollection of Australia is that is not a big hang-up. So I hope you guys will forgive me. So what is halacha and what is Jewish law? These are, of course, very big questions. I'll tell you a conventional way to think about it is, well, halacha is made up of deoraita, laws from the Torah, derabanan, laws that have been instituted by the rabbis over the centuries. And then, since Lag Bomer was mentioned, it's a very good one, minhag, various practices that have accumulated over the centuries and have become part of the Jewish life and to some degree Jewish law. And tonight being Lag Bomer, right now being Lag Bomer for you, I think that's a great example of that third category. There's not a whiff of it in the Talmud or even in the medieval period. It's really something that develops the last few hundred years and is changing as we speak. So that's a very traditional way to think about it. And I'm a law professor, as I think was mentioned. My dean will tell you that my job is to teach contracts and insurance law, and which I do. So I was thinking about it more from that perspective. And we always translate the word halacha as Jewish law. And by I say we, it's actually relatively recently that happens. I think if you go back, it's a project I want to undertake. If you go back in English, at least 150, 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, I think you will see different translations. But certainly, since I've been around, that's the conventional translation. And there's good reasons for it, right? If we think of so many of the things that we do or don't do as Jews, why do we have two sets of dishes? And yes, why do you have two sets? Well, the law is you need to have milk and meat dishes, right? Why do you not turn the lights on Shabbat? Well, the law is that we don't turn the lights on Shabbat. Why do you wear tefillin every day? Well, that's the law. So that's a very sort of common, intuitive, almost popular definition, and one that I think is right, but only partially right. And I want to press on that. But then you think, okay, there's a lot of things that law does, that halacha does not do, and a lot of things halacha does that law doesn't do. So to use fancy words, it's over and under inclusive. And I got more and more interested in that. What do we miss by calling it law? What are we not paying attention to? So what do I mean? Let's take the under inclusive part. So when we think of law, our primary way of thinking of that is the law of the state, the law of Australia, the law of New South Wales, the law of Canada or China or the United States or the state of Pennsylvania. That means that it's situated within a distinct geography and it governs those people within that. Now, that's not how halacha works. Halacha is the law of a people, wherever they may be. And at least for a very, very long time, and maybe even forever in some ways, it has not been the law of the state, of a state. So right away, right, it's working a little bit differently, right? Most of us think that we're subject to halacha and the law of where we live, right? And we can talk about what happens if they conflict, but fundamentally, it's not built like those other things. It doesn't have the institutions, right? There are no, there may be courts, batei din, but those are usually voluntarily consented to, certainly in the modern era. There's no administrative agencies of halacha. There's none of the things that we think of the machinery of what the law and what the state are. On the other hand, and this is maybe the more interesting part, is that it also is doing much more than law. So I give an example in the book. A number of years ago, I was Shabbos in the shul where my in-laws davened on the Five Towns. The Five Towns being a large Orthodox community in the suburbs of New York. And there was a sign, a poster for a lecture that was going to be given on Shabbat afternoon by a visiting rabbi from Lakewood, New Jersey. And the topic was bidding competitively on property or goods when others are interested. Translated to the terms of modern law, this is something like tortious interference with contract. In other words, a topic that would interest only commercial lawyers and or weird people like law professors, but not something that would be of all of interest to anyone else, and certainly not something that we think would be appropriate Shabbos talk. This is business law. And yet here it was, rabbi, big hat, long beard, from a well-known yeshiva, giving this lecture to about 100 balabatim on Shabbos afternoon, some of which were lawyers, but none of which were practicing Jewish law lawyers. Not really such a thing. And then most people were, they just had other jobs. And I stepped back and I said, this is very strange. If I told you that in any other context on a weekend afternoon, there was a gathering of 100 or so people to discuss the finer details of a rather technical topic in commercial law, you would say this must be a law school conference, or maybe what we call here CLEs, the lawyers, they need to continuing legal education or something that context. But if I told you this was laymen and laywomen who are there for spiritual edification or nourishment, you would say that's crazy. This is not the subject matter nor the format of what usually happens there. And yet here it was. And I'm saying something's going on here. The word law is going to miss us out to capturing this, in some sense, very normal if you've brought up in the system, but if you're able to step back, some very strange activity. What's going on here? Maybe to just take one other spin at it. How many of you have been to a bar mitzvah or a sheva brachas or a birthday party or any event, and it says, okay, someone will now give a dvar Torah. And sometimes it's kind of, I would say, more popular feel-goody stuff, certainly possible, but also not impossible that it might get a little bit technical. Well, there's a Gemara here and a Gemara here, and what does it mean? I said, look, I've hung around lawyers in law schools for about half my life now. Some of them very prominent and very well known. And I've never seen at a moment of kind of intense personal joy or sorrow, someone get up and say, listen, section 23.2 of the tax code has this point. But if you look in the bankruptcy code, it says this. And how do they interact? And that would be insane. And yet, how many of us have been not only to a shiur, but to some, I would say, more casual social event or at a yard site where something like that happens? And I think we've all been to some version of that. And that, to me, is indicative of the fact the word law isn't quite capturing this, because it's immediately sending us down a certain road, which has benefits which we should think about, but also misses a lot.
So what is it then that, I caught the words spiritual edification. People are there on a Shabbos afternoon to learn about the Jewish approach to the tortious interference into a contract for their spiritual edification. We wouldn't associate,
weird, right?
Yeah, that's very weird. We would not associate that sort of activity with spiritual edification. So why do we as Jews equate that sort of intellectual engagement with spiritual edification or religious observance? And I think that takes us to an aspect of
we got to get back to Jesus here.
Sorry?
We got to get back to Jesus.
Yeah, we do have to, and exegesis. But Matthew and Jesus, and I captured someone's attention in my shul when I was talking about this series by saying that you had a section in your book called "Was Jesus Correct or Was Jesus Right?" So, but that's the nub of it, right? Because we're all aware of that critique of Jewish law, and if we are honest with ourselves, we've all felt it at one time or another. It's the preoccupation of Jewish law with technical detail and human interaction at what appears to be the expense of broader concepts of morality and justice. So there are two issues there. One is, well, there are a whole range of issues, but one is the utter preoccupation of Jewish law with that level of interactive detail and pilpul. And the other is, how is that a spiritual engagement?
Sure. So
Now,
those are really big questions. I'm not going to answer them all for you today. Or the sun is coming up already. So, but I think we could talk about it. So let's talk about Jesus. So why did I start a book? Right. I think I already wrote an unconventional book about halakha. Starting it with a discussion of Jesus, it would have been just unconventional enough with that. Why did I start there? So to some degree, for the point that you raised, I think it's important to understand that as early as we might talk about halakha, and that can be debated, how far back do we go and call it halakha? But I like to say the Mishnah to me is the clear start of what we call the halakhic process, right? From the Torah to the Mishnah is very hard to figure out how that all works. But from the Mishnah to the Mishnah Brura, you can chart it through its text. And then, there's historical and dating questions here, which we could get into, but I don't think are so germane to this point. Jesus lives, if we take at face value the dating of the Mishnah to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and Jesus' life to when it's sort of, or the Gospels to when they purport to be written, it's about 150 years or so before. And clearly Jesus is contemporaneous with Hillel and Shammai with the early stages of the Mishnah, more or less, and certainly living in the same area. And what to me is so interesting is that just as the project of the rabbis of Chazal, of the Mishnah and later the Talmud, gets started, maybe even before, when it's in its most nascent stages of formulation, already we have an internal, because remember, today we think of Christianity as external, but at the time, certainly an internal critique of like, hey guys, what are you doing? And what I'll call the Jesus critique is exactly as Justice stated, a sense that all this form, right, all the focus on these little details is going to obscure and cloud your vision. So
can I just interrupt there, Professor, to point out, I think we've discussed this, and that is, of course, that the critique, though internal, that has become in a sense external through the evolution of Christianity, remains internal even within Chazal, literature of Chazal, so that we find with Korach, the Midrash reconstructs the dialogue between Korach and Moses in almost precisely the same fashion. That is, Korach criticizes Moshe as the symbol of rabbinic law in terms of the imposition of burdensome law on the widow, for example, who loses a husband and then has to tithe her crops, and the insistence or emphasis of Jewish law on ritual observance at the expense of her personal sorrow and humanity. So the critique didn't begin with Jesus, and it remains internal. In other words, this is an issue that is emphasized by Chazal unapologetically, even within still the realm of Jewish traditional rabbinic literature.
Yeah, I think that's right. You could even go further and to say that the prophets and Nevi'im had their version of this, right?
Yes.
Some of the most famous Haftorah that we read are they're cast a little bit differently, right? They're typically cast of Why are you so focused on the details of the temple service? What about all these other things?
And
But
hence,
yes,
hence the prophets have become the heroes of many small R reform movements within the
correct.
Jewish community.
Correct. So all
And
that is right. It's both. So I would say, just if we think historically, it is at the moment that this edifice of the Mishnah is emerging, and it's right with it at the same time this critique is emerging. As you said, this critique remains internal through the Talmudim, through Tanakh, through Chazal, and then is often the cleavage point between internal Jewish dissensions, right? Maybe most famously, in the 19th century, the Reform movement, but before that as well, the Karaite movement to some degree, the Sadducee movement to some degree, and takes on an external dimension through Christian readings of their own sources, becomes a source of anti-Semitic critique through the Middle Ages, and the truth is into modernity as well. So that to me is not answering your question yet, but just sort of framing
what's
this.
the answer to the critique, I think.
Well, we'll get there. But just framing this that this is nothing new. And to me, again, it was important to start that way, to say, like, it's there right at the beginning. Now, what is the answer, or what is an answer? So part of me says as follows. So one answer has been to basically deny the premise, right? To say no, it's very good that Jewish law is like this, right? This is maybe consistent with a modern Haredi approach, and you see this also, elements of this throughout the tradition. And to basically say, you're only asking that because you're seeing it from the outside. But the problem with that is, as Justice noted, is that that's not paying attention to the internal voices making the same point. The other move has been to try to shrink the role of law and legalism within Judaism. Say, look, there's other things. There's biblical material, there's poetic material, there's midrashic material, there's Kabbalistic, especially on the 33rd day of the Omer material, right? There's all this other stuff, and like, okay, so, don't overemphasize. So in part, I thought that both of those are not the approach I want to look at, and say, okay, listen, this is right there. This is right there. Now I'll push, Justice, you opened the, with my opening quote from Matthew, which I pair with a quote from the Mishnah. And I think this makes for a nice debate, because Matthew says, why are you worrying about tithing the dill, the mint, and the cumin, right? And you're not worried about the big picture. And he is, I think, referencing an idea that then appears in the Mishnah that has a straightforward discussion about whether you have to to tithe what we would call herbs. And once you think of it in the Mishnah's terms, it's a good question, because food needs to be tithed. Weeds and grass don't need to be tithed. Herbs are this kind of borderline question. Are they food that you're growing for consumption purposes, or do they just happen? And I think that is the basis of which you could see a rabbinic discussion going knee deep in, well, what do you mean by food and what do you mean by herbs, right? And then someone looking like, you guys are missing the whole point. So I always say, when people are having debate and one person's reductio ad absurdum is the other person's, yes, of course, then we've got a good argument, because we're just coming at it from very different perspectives. So my approach is to say, well, and to tie it to our first conversation, if law is everything, then maybe everything is law. In other words, what is happening in these details? What is happening in these conversations? Is it merely a discussion about practice, the way it's maybe conventionally seen? I try to make the argument that on halakha's own terms, that makes no sense. There's too much going on there about topics that are too diverse and too weird and too far away from anything that is related to practice in the narrow sense, what do we do at this moment, to make sense of that. And much of the book is examples of Talmudic topics that, on the one hand, sort of delve into almost an absurd ridiculousness of this preoccupation with details, and to show how, in I think many stages of the development of halakha, from the Mishnah to the Talmud down on, this is being used as a way to convey information, discussions, analysis of what Jesus or Matthew called the weightier matters of the law. In other words, to understand that for the rabbis, these discussions are not separate. They don't belong to separate realms, law and philosophy, law and morality, etc. There is this concept called halakha, and that if halakha is so large, if everything's halakha, halakha is also everything. So I'm happy to discuss an example or two, maybe to kind of flesh this out a bit. But I want to turn it back.
Yeah, I wonder whether a particular incident that happened, when I was at the bar, organised CLEs, continuing legal education for barristers, and I had an opportunity because there was a visiting halachic scholar, and there was a topical legal and moral issue. So I got this halachic scholar he was an English rabbi an English scholar living in Israel. He spoke good English. And I got, from the local Catholic university, I got a priest who was also a professor in moral theology and a lawyer, and one other, I can't remember who the third one was, and I got them on a panel to discuss this issue.
Sounds like a good beginning of a good joke, right?
Well, it was. It was actually hilarious because each of them did an outstanding imitation of themselves. In other words, the moral theologian spoke only about morality and God, and the rabbi did not mention God once. and that, we laugh at that, but it's very true. The rabbi was engaged in an analytical discussion of the law, as if there was no religious dimension, and the moral theologian priest was utterly focused on God and relationship with God and the will of God. Now, that was quite an extreme manifestation of the difference. But I wonder if that takes us into a discussion about the fundamental nature of Jewish law that begins possibly at Sinai, when God is revealed to the people and the people repel a direct relationship with God and say to Moshe Rabbeinu, look, it's a bit much. The direct relationship with God is a bit much. You talk to God, let us know through the medium of your human mind what it is that God wants. And I think that set the scene in many respects for a fundamental aspect of Jewish law, which is that Jewish law is not just simply the revelation of God's will. And in Christianity and other faiths, the words such as revelation and grace, talking about God's direct relationship with individuals, receives tremendous emphasis. Of course, we believe in revelation, but we don't really use words like revelation and grace. We use words like covenant and commandment rather than revelation and grace, because from the genesis of the Sinai experience, our religious experience is God's wisdom or God's will mediated through the human mind into human experience. And that generates this discussion and mediated concept of godliness strictly through human experience. Perhaps you can.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I teach at Villanova. It's a Catholic university. So I have been on these panels, and I remember I was once paired. I might have literally done this, paired with a professor of systematic theology, and I'm like, I have no idea what systematic theology is, but I'm sure we don't have that. Not systematic and not theology.
Certainly
But
not systematic, yeah.
but I think your insights are right. Now, look, to be fair, I think if one is coming from a more Hasidic worldview, they would likely speak in Jewish but Hasidic/Jewish terms more directly about. They wouldn't use the word grace and revelation, but they would have their own language of doing so. But
well, the language they use actually is mitzvahs from the word savta b'chibur. In other words, by doing a mitzvah, you directly connect to God. So that's the concept.
Right. So I think just to put that on the table, but your basic point is correct, and I think taking that back into the story of Matan Torah at Sinai makes sense, and I think that's the way Chazal, to a degree, thought about that. We have to concretize these things into life. So let me just kind of give a few examples, that may sort of help. So a very common discussion we have today is what goes by the work-life balance situation, right? So many of us are professionals, have busy jobs that take a demand from us, and then we have other obligations to family, to religion, to other things, and this, in the modern idiom, is known as the work-life balance. So you will scour the Talmud for the words work-life, whether in Hebrew and Aramaic, and you won't find it. But anyone who's learned Masachet Brachot knows that there's a Mishnaic discussion about, well, you have to pray Daven Shacharis, or really Kriyat Shema, right at the beginning of the day. The Talmudic era workday was from sun up to sundown. So then, how do you manage that? So there's slightly different rules for Kriyat Shema and for Shemona Esrei, for what we call, the Shachar and Amidah. And which one is on account of the employer? Which one is on account of the employee? How do you fit? So to me, this is a discussion that you could read it thinly and say, all right, how do you fulfill your obligation to say Kriyat Shema? But I think that there's a much thicker discussion here, which is, listen, there are various realms of responsibility. There is responsibility to God, and there's responsibility to your employer. And here we have an intricate Talmudic discussion that is grabbing that by the horns and is trying to figure out what the boundaries of that is. Now, if you look at these discussions, they're not only legal. They quote stories, they quote agadot, they quote verses. In other words, these are multifaceted discussions, often, that are dealing with both the very practical, and it's anchored in this like act-based thing, but clearly, as developed in the Talmud, get up to the more, not only, I would say, both theological, but also philosophical questions of how these things are balanced. Let me give you another example. This is famous because it's a song. Everyone goes to a wedding, and one of the common songs is Ketzav Meraktin Lifnei Hakala. How do you dance in front of the bride? Now that's of course taken from a discussion in Masechet Ketubot.
I think people now think it's taken from Mordechai ben David.
That's right. So the Gemara stole it from Mordechai ben David. So that's a nice song. We might as well talk about it. And it records a debate between Hillel and Shammai, or Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, as follows. Suppose the bride is not the most beautiful bride in the world. Happens. So Beit Hillel say, you always say Kala Nava Chasuda, right? You always praise her as beautiful and righteous. And Beit Shammai say, no, you say Kala Kamot Shehi. You have to kind of evaluate it ad hoc, and then praise and dance in front of the Kala as fitting. Now, again, you'll scour the Talmud for a discussion of what is truth, and you won't find it. What you will find is this discussion, which is, are there situations where the absolute truth is required? And are there situations where absolute truth is not the way to go, and that you bend for social convention, for someone on their wedding day, etc. Again, in philosophy class, this would we may get to Kant and the categorical imperative, and you would discuss this in a very abstract manner. The Talmud doesn't do that. That's a very Greek way of thinking of it. It's going to base it in this action, but I don't think this action is really about the action, right? It's putting it, but in a sort of place of life where this might come up. And then it's spinning from there a discussion of, well, how do we balance values of truth and the need to be honest with other things that compete with that, right? Social interactions, social graces, etc. So there's another example. You could think this, I say the wrong way to read this Talmudic sugya is, I got a shaila, Rebbe. I was at a wedding and the kala wasn't so pretty and I didn't know what to do, right? So you could read it that way. But you could say, wait a minute, this is a situs, a location to have this discussion about, let's say, truth and social grace, or however we might think about that. And part of what I want to argue for, and part of what I think Jesus missed, to come back to that, is that, sure, you can always read each of these things in its most reductive, thin manner. And then you will come to Jesus's conclusion that all we're doing is fighting about, and poking about these very narrow questions and not addressing the weightier matters of law. But, and my argument is that we're not here doing anything new. We're just following the Talmudic reading itself. And if we do that, we see that no, these are opportunities. These are moments through which these deeper questions are and can be addressed. Now, am I going to tell you that every discussion in the Talmud is like that? I can't make that claim. What I can say is we can see that in some places very clearly, and whether that ought to be a template for a way to view a broader set of materials. Not the only way. I think it's silly to insist people are doing daf yomi, right? That every twist and turn in the Yevamot is loaded and freighted with existential meaning. I think that pulls the whole thing too far.
Well, I want to actually, Professor Saiman, I just interpose
let
there.
me just finish, but nor would I pull it the other way and say that there's never anything beyond this sort of very two-dimensional question of what do I do here? Because I think the truth is somewhere in between, and we ought to be open to that and approach it that way.
Yeah, I want to interpose with two observations. One is, and people who are online from my shul in Perth will have heard this from me ad nauseum. And the other comment relates to your reference to the Gemara in Yevamot, because I happened to stumble across something very interesting that relates to this that might generate some discussion, although we don't have a lot of time. The first one is, we're coming up to Shavuot when you read the Megillat Ruth. Now, the book of the story of Ruth has what I think is one of the greatest examples of rabbinic killjoy. That is, they take something incredibly uplifting and inspiring and poetic and turn it into the most mundane and prosaic legal discussion. And that is probably one of the most famous verses in the whole Bible, the Jewish Bible, where Ruth decides, declares her loyalty to Naomi, and she said, where you go, I shall go, your people are my people, where your God is my God, where you die, I shall die. They are it's a very uplifting passage of the Bible. The rabbis denude the passage of any uplifting or inspirational content and reconstruct the passage into dry halachic argument. So where you die, I shall die, the rabbis distill a number of not only mundane, but quite gory halachot about capital punishment before the Sanhedrin, and it reconstructs the passage in a not just a prosaic way, but a mundane way, but in a highly legalistic. And my claim is that the rabbis knew exactly what they were doing. It's not as if the rabbis thought this passage has no poetic or inspirational content. The rabbis were saying, we know it has poetic and inspirational content, and you should receive it and read it that way. But that's just not enough for Judaism. Judaism does not finish at the level of moral abstraction, poetic inspiration, unless you reduce that to the prosaic performance of law, then your inspiration will not be sustained. And so I think the whole project of the Talmud, in many ways, I suggest, is a very deliberate, it's not as if the rabbis sat down and said, we're not going to deal with moral theology, but it's a very deliberate, directed attempt to take spirituality as it first manifested at Sinai and direct it to beyond theology, beyond morality, beyond abstract, beyond the abstract, into the mundane, the prosaic, and the practical. So my claim is that it's not as if the rabbis were unaware of what they were doing. They were quite aware of what they were doing, and it's quite deliberate. Do you?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right at a number of levels, right? So, and I want to pull it to what we were saying before. In other words, on the one hand, this duality that you're saying between, here's how I would respond in agreement, but slightly reframed, is that the Talmudic project is a rejection of this duality between, thinking big thoughts and doing little actions. That's the way I think as Westerners, we're trained, and think of our traditions, right? When we talk about philosophy, we are, that word, of course, is a Greek concept, and that concept is developed in the Greco and then Roman world, and then through the Western intellectual tradition. And then law and action really comes at a different place. And I think your descriptions of Christian theologians fits that. And part of what I want to argue is that the Talmud is rejecting that duality. In other words, that on the one hand, to have these conversations, we need to anchor them in something particular, but also because the doing of it is central to the way of life and to the way that these values are instantiated within community and within life. An example that comes to mind as you were talking is Shabbat, of course. So, at least formally, the Christian world, of course, they changed Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday, but at least in the imagination, it should be the Lord's Day, right? And probably in Australia, certainly in America, there was a time where that had some sort of public recognition. But what you see is that it's very hard to hold on to that, right? Without requiring and kind of putting it into concrete terms, that thing can be ephemeral. And by the way, I don't think this is just accidental. So if you look in the 16th century, there are debates. Well, they say, well, look, Jesus already, to go back to him, abstracts Shabbat in the New Testament. He says, well, right, it's really about a day of rest, and that, can apply beyond the particular rules, and that makes sense. And then you'll see later interpreters say, well, that should apply all the time, right? So why limit it to just Shabbat? That should be every day. And then if every day is Shabbos, no day is Shabbos. And that's sort of a little bit what happens. So I think that abstraction is, of course, important, but abstraction without relationship to concrete actions tends to be abstraction and then could be abstracted away into the ether. One of the things you see in halakha is a constant back and forth between things like this. Sometimes they're abstracted, sometimes they're concretized. And I would say that the Talmudic project is an attempt to grab both by the horns and ride that bull. It's difficult. And I would say sometimes in certain areas or certain things, things can take a left turn and maybe go too far in one way or the other. But I think it's very important to understand that, at least in my view, baked into the Talmudic project is an understanding of both these poles and is an attempt to try to wed them together rather than rip them apart.
Okay, I'm just going to, we're going to have to wrap up soon and perhaps invite some questions, but I wanted to throw something else at you, which we might develop in a subsequent discussion, and it's the thing that I stumbled across in Yevamot. And it's this notion that, notwithstanding what we've said about the character of the Talmudic project, you occasionally come across within the dialogue and parameters of halachic discussion, you sometimes confront these broad meta-halachic moral interjections. And so the one which is quite confronting, the one I just stumbled across was that people might be familiar with the story of the Gibeonites and David HaMelech, King David. So in the book of Samuel 2, the second book of Samuel, there's a famine, and King David goes, and I can't remember exact details, but by some reason he concludes that it's something to do with the Gibeonites, the Givonim, and he approaches them because somehow he thinks they're the key to solving the problem of the famine. There's a dialogue, and ultimately they say, well, really what we want to avenge the unfair and immoral treatment of our people by King Saul, because he persecuted us when we came to convert to Judaism, and he discriminated against us unfairly. And so King David hands over 7 descendants of King Saul to the Gibeonites, and they hang them. And the Talmud points out a whole range of halachic problems. I mean, they interpose the halachic dimension into this biblical story, which itself is interesting. But then they point out that a number of the things that King David did in the context of this episode are contrary, not just to halakha, but express commandments or prohibitions in the Torah. And the Talmud answers that by saying, well, there was a broader consideration than the Torah law here, and that is the not bringing the Jewish people and as God's people into disrepute for the discrimination and abuse that King Saul leveled at the Gibeonites. And therefore, the Torah law was suspended so that people could understand and appreciate the justice of the way Jewish people behave as God's people, and the law, even the express Torah law, was suspended to that broader moral end. And it's a very interesting passage of Talmud, and you come across these from time to time. It's not the only example, but one suddenly confronts, all of a sudden, this whole halachic project is suspended for some broader meta-halachic moral purpose. And so I find that the parameters of that are very undefined, very obscure, but extremely interesting. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, I think that is important in the following sense, right? The Talmud is, it's just an enormous collection of stuff, we'll call it, of raw materials that then has to be processed. So what you see there is, so all of a sudden this principle is there. And now the question is, which later on as we face analogous questions, not perfectly analogous, in our own times, when are we going to draw on that source and use it to do something similar in our day? And to me, I think the fact that it's in the Talmud, that the Talmud even puts it into King David's considerations, is an important resource for when we will confront something like this in our day, because that provides a beachhead or a precedent, to use legal terms, to do that. So I think there, right, what you have is a sense that, yes, there is these structures, and they're very important. And maybe I'll fold it this way. Now, the Talmud itself is this very strange mix of a text that's extremely reverential towards its tradition, and at the same time has an extreme, almost irreverence or plasticity towards it, right? In other words,
very Jewish.
It's very Jewish, right? And I really believe this, that it is a intensely Jewish work, not only because it's, of course, a work by Jews, about Jews, etc., but because it has this almost maddening kind of sense of its own authority and the way it relates to its authority. So we talk either about the Mishnah vis-a-vis the Torah, or we talk about the Amoraim vis-a-vis the Tanaim. On the one hand, a deep reverence, a sense that we can't move from this, a sense that we are under this. On the other hand, a playfulness at times, an ability to reinterpret at times, and an ability to make it our own. And I think that that's like really important. And here you have an example of it. Now that too kind of ebbs and flows over time. Yeah. But I think that that's why, even though today we have Maimonides' code and the Shulchan Aruch and 1,000 of sort of commentaries underneath that all try always to cabin the law, I think there's a reason that the Jewish traditions always said, no, we return to the Talmud, to that source, because that dialogue, or those dialogues, are, I think, essential to the way we can and should and do view the law.
That's the human creativity, which is, as we've said, the very basis of Jewish law, is that human-centric, human creativity. I'm going to hand over back to Rav Alon now, because I think there might be one or two questions, and then we need to wrap up, because I don't want to keep people longer than the scheduled time. So Rav Alon, over to you.
Thank you so much to Justice Solomon, to Professor Saiman. There's just one question in the chat that I think is an interesting thing, just to ground us back to the beginning of the conversation, which really is just an understanding of what is the role of mitzvot today. Justice Solomon, Rabbi Solomon, you mentioned that the sort of the Hasidic idea that doing mitzvot connects us with God, and yet we know that following the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, following the destruction of the temple, we lost our intermediary with the Kohen Gadol and the whole process of connecting with God as outlined in the Torah. So how did we evolve into this idea of mitzvot as a sort of a personal way of connecting with God, and so bringing that legal and spiritual sort of in combination and synthesis together with one another?
I think foundational to Judaism is that we emphasize the concept of mitzvah is to perform what God, through the medium of the human mind, has instructed us to do, and we thereby create that relationship with God. In Chassidut, that's Savta v'chibur, but in a broader sense, we emphasize covenant over revelation. That is, in Judaism, our relationship with God is mutual. It's not, revelation is one-sided. God reveals. With us, it's the covenant of Sinai. So it's a mutual, it's an agreement, essentially. The concept of a legal agreement is at the foundation of our relationship with God in Judaism. It's a Brit. We are the covenantal community. And so we forge our relationship with the spiritual through the concept of an agreement of Brit, through obedience to God's command, and that command is conveyed through the medium of the human mind, the human experience, and human intelligence. So I'm not sure if that answers. Perhaps Professor Saiman can do a better job at directing an answer to that question.
Well, I'm not going to comment too much on Hasidic thought. I'll just try to tie this up and relate to that. Sort of implicit what I'm saying, what we've been talking about, is that why Torah study is maybe or at least a central mitzvah. And to my mind, implicit what we've been saying is that part of the mitzvah of doing any particular action is understanding its roots, its source, these debates around it, and ideally how these. So when we, as I said, when we, and I'm going to go to Shacharit shortly, when we do that, right? Why are we doing this? What is the context that this fits in, right? And as I said, that this question of Shema in the morning does compete with other things, right? Does compete with morning obligations, with morning routines, with professional duties, right? And that understanding that is part of the it. Or to mangle a phrase elsewhere, the medium is the message. And I think that that's why the study, right, as we said, in general legal systems, legal knowledge is for the lawyers, and everyone else follows it, right? ideally. And when you consult a lawyer, when you get in trouble, right? The rabbinic view is not that way. It's that Torah study is for everybody. It is an essential part of the mitzvah, because I don't think these things can really be ripped apart. And as you say, as anyone who's done anything, right, the more you invest in it, both physically, but also morally and intellectually, the more you get out of it. And I think that's the idea. And that's why the space, to return to how I started, the space of law and of legal study in Judaism is just set at such a different level than in any other system, because secular state law or even religious law, because this is the claim that's being made. These things are not separate, they're connected, they're integrated, and they're essential to the performance.
Thank you both. I just saw that as a really good question from my president, but I'm going to actually hold that question off until our third talk, because Dr. Ehrlich asks, how does pragmatism and halacha evolve in the light of time and development? And that is a really strong question, a very important question, but it is something we're going to hopefully touch base on in our third session of this series. Tonight we've had a really beautiful opportunity to understand a little bit. It's a real micro glimpse of the nature of Jewish law. Justice Solomon, thank you for your time, and Professor Saiman, thank you for yours. For anyone who wants to get a fuller and more in-depth understanding of part of this conversation that we've been having tonight, you can see in the chat, I've put the link to Professor Saiman's book, Halacha, the Rabbinic Idea of Law. It is perhaps one of the most interesting and, for me personally, transformative books. I was going to say sfarim that I've read, but it's a really gripping read, as wild as that sounds when I say it. But I do encourage you to look at that. Booktopia has it on sale. Next Wednesday evening at 8 p.m. here in Sydney and 6 p.m. over in Perth, we will be, and 6 a.m.
At 6 a.m. in Philadelphia.
6 a.m. in Philly, we will be looking at the contrast between Jewish and civil law. We'll be further in this conversation and expanding on what halacha is, looking at civil law, and really continuing this conversation as we move into the understanding of what the role of law is, and we continue in that path to not just a revelationary moment, but an opportunity to engage in the divine command and the covenantal people of Shavuot. So please join us back next week. Recordings will be sent out to everyone over the next day or two. Have a good night. And again, thank you very much for joining us, Professor and Justice, and everyone else who is on the Zoom. See you later.